When we say that someone has an ego, what we usually mean is that this person is arrogant or conceited. Really, we all have an ego. Ego just means a personal sense of identity, and as I explained in a previous video, there's nothing inherently wrong with this. What we often mean to say is that someone is egotistical, which refers more to an inflated or exaggerated sense of self-importance. It's the sense that one is better than others, that one is superior. It's often in relation to one's accomplishments, skills, or knowledge, or to a position of recognition, of leadership or authority. But that's not always the case. Sometimes a person might be egotistical for no apparent reason at all. In spirituality, there tends to be a lot of emphasis on transcending the ego, which would suggest that we're aiming to become less and less ego-centered. But something that I've observed is that there's a sort of spiritual egotism, which can be very tricky because it often disguises itself as being spiritually advanced, even to the point of being egoless. And this is something which I've observed within myself, as well as in many others, and so it seems to be pretty common. So, just to start, even when we refer to ourselves as spiritual, it's very easy to become strongly identified with that label, to become proud of it, to wear it as a badge, to basically fall deeper into the trap of ego. When you've taken up a spiritual practice or study, when you've acquired a great deal of information, or when you've received initiation or become successful in a career that is centered on a spiritual practice, or you've been given some position of authority, it's very easy to become proud, to become zealous and even arrogant. It's very easy to disregard one's own limitations and fall into the belief that one is enlightened or awake, that one has transcended the ego, when the reality may be that the ego has simply hidden itself under the guise of being some sort of a spiritual master. Just as a person forges an identity based upon material accomplishments, one can just as easily become identified with the trappings of a spiritual lifestyle. Instead of being identified with a political organization, for instance, we might identify with a spiritual or religious organization or tradition. Instead of being proud of academic or financial success, we might be proud of our spiritual achievements and practices. Rather than becoming identified with an academic title, one might be identified with a spiritual title or name. And just as we might feel a certain pride in acquiring worldly knowledge, we might feel a sense of pride in acquiring spiritual knowledge. So there can be just as much ego in having become a certified yogi as there is in becoming a rock star. In fact, there are many yogis today who have attained a rock star status. And it can be difficult to remain humble when so many others look up to you for guidance and instruction. So it's very important to watch yourself, to keep yourself in check. When we take pride in such accomplishments, we tend to compare our advancement to the inexperience of others. The ego loves to feel superior. It loves to feel as though it's more important than others. And sometimes there's no greater feeling of superiority than the illusion of spiritual mastery. But even if we're not necessarily in a position of authority, we can still tend to think of ourselves as being more advanced than others, as more important or better than others, simply because we've acquired some spiritual information or have committed to a particular practice. Oftentimes, our spiritual identity will disassociate us from what we would consider to be ordinary worldly people. But this identity, again, is just a subtler form of egotism, which can easily become just another obstacle to genuine spiritual growth. What is it that actually makes a person spiritual? Are some people more spiritual than others? Some people may be more aware of their spiritual nature. Some may be more in touch with it. But as soon as you identify with that in such a way that you divide yourself from others, thinking less of them, you've let the ego regain control. It's all too easy to divide everyone up between those who we would call spiritual and those who we would call worldly, those who are awake and those who are asleep, all the while ignoring the fact that so many of us are actually somewhere in between. But we don't want to be in the middle. We want to be fully enlightened. And so we tend to ignore or even deny our lower nature. As soon as we gain some intellectual or conceptual understanding of enlightenment, we try to force our way into that role. We try to transcend our lower nature by simply ignoring it and imitating those who we perceive as enlightened beings. But ignoring doesn't resolve our issues. It really just postpones the process. And when we first become interested in spirituality, we tend to have a strong hunger for information. We want to understand the whole thing, and so we often read a great deal on the topic. We fill our heads with concepts and information until we feel like we've got it all figured out. But what we often fail to realize is that we're really just feeding the intellect. We're just gathering information. That information may or may not be based upon truth, but we can't ever truly know anything until we've experienced for ourselves. Until then, it's just intellectual filler. Spirituality is really about direct personal experience, but often we substitute that experience with information. We gather up concepts which perhaps resonate with us, or because they seem logical and reasonable, or because they give us a sense of comfort. But we forget that without direct experience, these are merely concepts. They're merely ideas. They're simply thoughts and beliefs. So we gather up these concepts and beliefs, and we develop a basic idea of what spiritual life is supposed to look like, what enlightenment is supposed to look like. And then we try to live up to that image. But the way in which we often go about it is by trying to bypass all of the aspects within ourselves which we've come to label as worldly or dark or negative. We tend to see those aspects as being bad or evil, and deep down we might feel a sense of shame about them. And so in order to distract ourselves from that shame, we might try to shift our attention and judgments onto others. We might notice aspects in other people which we would deem worldly, in comparison to our practices that, if we're doing a yoga or meditation every day, or, and so we're making these comparisons and we're looking at them and we're thinking, they're not as spiritual as I am. Or maybe because of all the spiritual information we've gathered, and we feel that we're more knowledgeable, we look at other people and we think, well, they're not as knowledgeable as I am. They're not as spiritual as I am. But it's really, we do this to distract from looking at our own flaws and imperfections, our own shadow side. And we think that by denying that shadow side, we're making advancement, but actually we're really just building up more barriers. We're trying to hide from ourselves, essentially. So for many of us, being spiritual is all about dressing a certain way and adopting a new language, maybe joining some sort of a spiritual social club, memorizing key spiritual teachings, which we can then recite at will. We might learn some yoga poses. We might set up an altar in our home. We begin wearing a mala and some crystals. Maybe we change our name to something that sounds a little more mystical. And we think that these things make us more spiritual, but these are merely external embellishments. And often we're just following trends. We don't even really understand why we're doing the things we're doing. We may not really understand what any of it means. And while we carry ourselves in a way that says to others, look at how blissful and mystical I am, on the inside we may be a mess of confusion and insecurity, and we don't even want to acknowledge that. We don't want to look at that. So certainly we don't want others to see it. So we put on a smile and we go on pretending that it's all love and light. So somewhere along the way, we've gotten this idea that in order to be enlightened, we must destroy the ego. But often it's just easier to simply deny that the ego is there. So we might convince ourselves somehow that the ego has been destroyed, but often we're just fooling ourselves. And this is one of the most hazardous forms of egotism, because it's the ego denying its very own existence. So when someone says, for example, that they have no ego, or that they have dissolved their ego, you can almost be certain that it's their ego doing the talking. I've met a lot of people that have made that claim, and it's clear that they don't really know what they're talking about, that they've somehow deluded themselves. And I think that when a person goes around telling people that they have no ego, and they're obviously very proud of it, it just goes to show that the ego is still there, just as strong as ever before, and has simply taken on the guise of a spiritual master. So I think we have to be very careful not to fall into that trap. Spirituality is really about authenticity. And we're not being authentic if we're pretending to be enlightened. Authenticity means owning all of our bullshit, being aware of it, aware of all of our blockages and limiting beliefs. And I think we have to acknowledge when we're too much attached to a concept such as enlightenment or egolessness. The very concept itself can be the very thing standing in the way of our direct experience. So really, we need to be able to let go of these kinds of concepts. We have these ideas about what enlightenment is supposed to be, what it's supposed to feel like, but if we haven't experienced that, then what do we really know? Our beliefs about it could be very inaccurate, and if they are, then we're not going to find it because we may be looking for the wrong thing. So we need to just get rid of these ideas. Again, we're talking about being authentic, and that means if ego is there, we simply acknowledge it. We can't force enlightenment to happen, and you can't fake it till you make it, because that's not being authentic. So we really need to watch all of this very closely. Just pay attention to how we're living, how we think and speak, and just notice when we're not coming from authenticity. And we don't have to judge ourselves either. It's not about judgment. It's simply about being more aware of our own bullshit. What's most important is that we're being honest, not only with others, but more importantly with ourselves. We're not going to resolve our issues by denying them. So let's stop trying to be so spiritual and simply allow ourselves to be authentic. Let's acknowledge all of the ways in which we don't measure up to the spiritual ideal and just accept ourselves as we are in this moment with love and with patience. And maybe just owning up to where we are right now with all of our illusions and blockages, our flaws and imperfections, our limitations and our shortcomings, and our ego identifications. Maybe just owning up to all of this is the most spiritual thing we can do.